There are three basic elements or central elements of the landscape model, and they include the ecosystem, which is all about understanding where kids' starting points are, right, by virtue of all of their learning experiences, their identities, their cultural identity at home, their access to different kinds of learning experiences when they were younger, the quality of the teachers the year before, all of those things that make up their starting point, really understanding who they are and what they bring into the classroom with them. The second element is the horizon, and that's all about co-constructing goals with students, so that our assumptions about what they might be capable of don't limit in any way where they're trying to go, right? And so that students are always feeling that they're setting horizons for themselves that not only are things that they can accomplish, but that are also appropriate challenge, appropriate growth, and connected to their own aspirations, and even on some level to the aspirations of their families. When we start talking about culture especially, that's really important to keep in mind. Finally, the last element would be the pathway, and that's where the teacher is using student-centered pedagogies like project-based learning to ensure that students can go through their learning experience on multiple pathways, just like you would envision multiple trails in a landscape setting, right? If we're all starting from where we are and moving toward our own horizon, then there need to be multiple pathways for that growth process in the classroom. I think it's important to point out we're not talking about 40 different pathways for the 40 different kids in my classroom, right? That's not what we're talking about. And frankly, it does take some extra time initially, especially with the planning, to know how to manage a pedagogy like project-based learning so that you can have 5 or 6 or 7 different groups on slightly different pathways based on the interests and talents and true sort of nature of each of those groups of kids, right? We're big believers in what's called affinity mapping. In other words, getting students into groups based on a common interest, whether that's a common interest in topic or a common interest in what they want to produce, and really making sure that students are able to to move forward toward something that's meaningful, right? I think but to do so in a way that's personally relevant for them, right? So in terms of time for the teacher, I actually think it's a whole lot better use of time than trying to lecture to a group of 40 kids or keep them engaged or compliant with whatever we're trying to do in a larger classroom setting. And that's something that, I've been training people in project-based learning for a really long time, and it's one of the first things that I talk with them about, that it's not that we're going to have 40 different pathways and every kid doing something completely different. It's that we're going to try to get them into groups that leverage their interests and talents and where they are on the ecosystem in a way that's going to lead to extraordinary growth and engagement. Each one of the elements of the landscape model contains anywhere from 9 to 11 specific strategies, most of which are actually quite easy to do. And they are small steps to big change, right? They include, so for the ecosystem, this getting to know our students and knowing what they're capable of and who they are. We've got strategies like empathy interviews. We've got a strategy that comes from my background in global education that's all about understanding each other's culture. That's called the iceberg of culture, where students are sharing what do people think they know about me based on what they see on the surface, and then what's the 90% of who I am that others can't necessarily always see and what matters to me. For the element of the horizon, we have several different models for goal setting, including things that are fairly commonly used like SMART goal planning, but we also discovered this wonderful one called WOOP, which is an acronym for Wish, Outcome, Obstacles, and Plan, and it's all about thinking ahead for our goals. But it can also be something as simple as the letter I write to myself at the beginning of the school year. That was something I used to do every year in advisory in my own classroom, right? What are the things that I hope to be able to accomplish? What are the things that I want to be better at? What are the things that academically or even socially I really want to work on this year? That letter that we write to ourselves that we read again at the end of the school year. So simple things that get kids involved in thinking about goals, right? And being a part of that process as opposed to the teacher being the only one who ever sets the goals for them. And then in terms of the pathway, you've got a variety of different strategies from what I mentioned before, which was affinity mapping, and the ability to get kids into groups based on the things that they're interested in. You've got strategies like project-based learning, of course, which are much bigger steps, but even much smaller steps like getting kids to share their ideas, getting kids to, really focusing on this idea of multiple ways of solving a given challenge can make a huge difference. And the student-centered iterative planning model is one of those pieces that it doesn't require that you're using project-based learning, but it's a cycle that's an asset-based cycle that really asks us to consider who students are, what they're already good at, what they're curious about, how they learn best, and then how we can really leverage all of that in terms of their learning journeys. One of my favorite examples from the book comes from a group of elementary teachers who had developed this wonderful project on interdependence in society. And they had created all these plans for a project that was focused on their families and their community and their school and all the roles that people play and all this interdependence. And they were a few days into the project, things were going beautifully, when a huge colony, or multiple colonies potentially, of bees took over the campus. And all of a sudden, there's this major problem on campus, right? They're not allowed to go outside for recess at all because there are bees, hundreds of thousands of bees everywhere. Obviously, you're not going to just kill and exterminate all the bees, right? That's not something we do anymore. So there's going to be this whole long process of moving the bees off the campus somehow. And what are the kids curious about? Certainly not roles in society, right? All they really care about is what they're seeing out the window, which are these bees, and trying to understand what's going on. Well, and this connects to one of the core mistakes I think we make when it comes to curriculum, is if all of their goals had been very content-specific standards, right? If that were what mattered most, it would have been, okay, ignore the bees, kids, we got to focus on roles in society. But in this case, the curriculum hinged on that core concept of interdependence, right? And yes, there were some specific standards around roles in society, but they could teach interdependence by studying bee colonies just as easily as anything else, and weave in the human systems later in the process, but leverage that extraordinary excitement for the bees in the moment that it's happening, right? That's the kind of agile, like, it's not a huge replanning of everything, it's just a shift in how we're thinking about this given concept that allows us to continue to teach toward our standards, but to do so in a way that meets where kids are.